Chapter 28. Friday dinner time. Inside, Doreen put on a second pot of coffee. Max stood behind her and said, "I don't know if you're anxious to get out there and work on that right now, but it is past dinner time." She looked at him in surprise. "What time is it?" He tapped his watch. "It's after 6. If we're doing pasta, we still won't be eating until 6:30 or a quarter to 7. She nodded. "Food then. It should still give us an hour, maybe 2 hours to haul some of that basement stuff upstairs before I give out completely. I noticed you already put some stuff in the living room. Is that for Scott to check over?" She nodded. "And so far it seems to be a bit of a mismatch. I took out what I could, but I can't reach the dresser. It's still in the far back corner." "I remember that," he said. He pulled out a big pasta pot, filled it with water, and turned it on to boil with a lid on it, then brought out the sauce she had frozen and put it into a pot to warm up. She looked at him and asked, "Are we having the same thing as last time?" "Yep. We need a bit more sauce," he said, "so I'll extend it while the water for the pasta is heating up." With everything set, he said, "I want to go take a look at what you've pulled out so far." He walked into the living room and she stood there, saying, "See? It's just chairs and coffee tables at this point." He opened the living room door to the basement and disappeared. He came back a few minutes later, bringing up an odd-shaped high-backed winged chair. She looked at it and frowned. "That's odd, isn't it?" "I've seen them before," he said. "But I don't know if there are more of them. Nan seems to have a group of individual items down there. Hopefully by the time we get them all out, we'll know what belongs with what, so we can keep like things with like. We need to open up those big doors in the garage too. I can start on that end." She led the way through the kitchen into the garage, crying out in joy again as she walked into the big open space. She hit the lights, walked over to the double doors, and opened them wide. Max stood behind her and whistled. "Now that's a nice set of wide stairs." She nodded. "That really helps, doesn't it?" He went down the stairs from the garage side and turned on the lights in the basement, and now they could see the full extent of all the furniture down here. He groaned, motioned at one end of a table, and asked, "Can you lift that up?" She grabbed it, and together they lifted up a large dining room table, which they appended onto its legs, and set it in one corner of the garage. 6 trips later, Doreen wiped her forehead and said, "Maybe we should check the pasta pot." He grinned and nodded. "And you need a break." She rolled her eyes. "I tell you, since I arrived at Nan's, I've done more physical work than I have in a lifetime." At that, he burst out laughing. "It's probably good for you," he said. They trooped into the kitchen. Max stirred the sauce, added more tomato, some garlic, and she wasn't sure what all else, but it looked like various herbs, and then he added oil and salt to the big pot. He said, "We still have another 10 minutes before this thing is boiling. We can do 3 more trips." Privately, she thought they'd have time for 1 more trip, but she was willing to give him a chance. They walked back into the basement and he said, "Okay, what's next?" She looked around and said, "A couple really big mirrors are here as well." Carefully, Mac picked up one and carried it up. She picked up a much smaller one and carried it to the garage and then said, "You know what? It's foolish for you to carry stuff that I can take care of. Why don't you carry the bigger stuff, because I can do the rest on my own." He nodded, went back down, and grabbed a matching pot chair to the one they'd seen earlier. As she stood here in the basement, she pointed out a couch. "Looks like it matches the chairs." He nodded. "Looks like it." Instead of 3 trips, they ended up doing 5 trips before dinner time. As she carried up yet another mirror, Mac disappeared into the kitchen. Grateful, she followed him to see him adding the pasta to the big pot. "So, do we get to eat soon?" "A few minutes yet," he said. "Let's take another look in the basement." The garage was half full by now, with everything well spaced out instead of being stacked on top of each other. Mac and Doreen returned to the basement again. He looked at a few of the bigger pieces and said, "If we get those up into the garage, that'll give us access to some of these on the side here." It took several attempts to lift her end of the couch. Then she had to back up the stairs, so he carried the bulk of the weight. They stopped halfway, and then gamely she grabbed her end and lifted it up 2 more stairs. She shook her head at him. "I'm sorry. This is just really heavy." "Take your time," he said. "Every step you take, the closer we are to getting it into the garage." She sighed, bent down, gripped it again. "Lift with your knees," he warned, "not your back." She lifted using her quads and found it much easier. She got to the top and backed up slowly through the doors as Mac came up the stairs behind her. When they set it down, she said, "This couch is quite pretty." "Do you like it?" he asked. "It'd be a bitch to get into the living room, but if that's what you would like there." "Not until I hear what Scott has to say," she said. At that, he chuckled. "Still after the money, are you?" he teased. "I'm okay with modern furniture that's worth a fraction of what Scott took out of here," she said, "and I don't want anything worth big money with the animals to ruin it." "Good point," he said, disappearing into the kitchen. He came back out a few moments later while she was still resting and said, "Noodles aren't quite there. Let's get another bit done, then we can eat." She headed down herself, relieved to see the basement was at least half empty now. "We can probably get another 4 or 5 pieces into the garage," she said, "if they're not too big. Maybe we can sort these out here so they're not stacked, and Scott can take a walk through here too." "Yep, it's a good idea," he said. "Let's see if there's any more of that set." She pointed out 2 end tables and said, "I think those belong if you look at the bases of the feet." He nodded, grabbed both of them, handed them to her and said, "You can take those. And a big coffee table is there. I'll grab that." And he carried it up, putting it in front of the couch and the 2 pot chairs. She just smiled. Did Nan really buy all this stuff thinking about me down the road? It just boggles the mind. "It also means she had an inkling you would need it," he said with a sideways look at her. "She never really met my ex, but I think she understood from our conversations that I wasn't happy." "Did she know he was very wealthy?" "Yes, she did, but she also knew I was on a budget and couldn't spend money on what I wanted." "And yet you still had $5,000 outfits." "Yes, but he would instruct me to buy them, so as not to feel embarrassed by me at certain events," she said. "But when I gave $50 to an animal charity, he chastised me pretty heavily." "Wow, what a nice guy," Max said. "I know," she admitted. "I argued a couple times, and I did have some spending money I gave them, but it was still nothing compared to the amount he was spending on luxury items." Finally, Mac went back in, checked the spaghetti, returned to the garage, and said, "The water is back up to boil. It's almost done." She nodded and looked around the garage. "There's a little room here, but not a whole lot," she said. Motioning him into the basement again, she noted, "But a fair bit of room is here now." She lifted a couple chairs off another dining room table and set them up so they looked like they were seated at the table, and pulled the table toward her so she could set up the remaining chairs on the other side. "We still have to get the dresser out," Max said. "That's really not a piece you want to leave down here." "No," she said. She pointed out a couple big hutches too. "I wonder if they're of any value." "I don't know," he said, "but I can't even begin to lift those alone. You should also be checking the drawers. Knowing Nan, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they were full. Come on. Let's go eat. We can take another look afterward." They headed back up, and Doreen was grateful to see him drain the pasta. She cleared off the kitchen table and set 2 place settings, and very soon he walked over with 2 plates heaped with pasta and sauce. She looked at it with a happy sigh. "I was dreaming about this pasta ever since you made it the first time," she said. You could have used up the sauce anytime, he said. She shook her head. Not only did I not know how to warm it up, she said, I also didn't know how to cook the pasta properly. He nodded. Well, then that's my gain tonight. He complained good-naturedly, I could certainly use a good meal. I feel like you've put my muscles to heavy use today. She nodded. So what's with this person on that ID card, she asked, and he frowned at her. I don't know for sure, he said, but it's a cold case. Lowering her fork, she said, Seriously? He nodded, his face grim. But you can't say anything on that until I get a chance to tap into the database and see. She nodded. That wouldn't bode well for George if it was cut up and buried in his garden. Cut up, burnt, and buried in the garden, he corrected. But again, we don't know anything yet. She willingly put it out of her mind for now and tackled her spaghetti.